spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen the Godfather films, the Francis Ford Coppola films, the Godfather films. So Godfather, Godfather Part 2, and the Godfather Part 3. As some of you may know, now it's the end of November 2020, and so the film, The Godfather 3, has undergone a certain degree of revision or re-editing or reworking to a certain extent by Francis Ford Coppola, such that I think next month the reworked version of The Godfather 3, whatever that means, which will be given the title The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, is going to get a release. And I've already pre-ordered my Blu-ray, so I can't wait for that to arrive and watch it, because as I say, I'm a huge fan of these films, very much so. I haven't spoken, maybe I've spoken very briefly about some of them, but not to any great detail as much as I would like. But I am a huge, huge fan of these films, and I rewatch them actually quite regularly, and I really enjoy them. I find them to be very elliptical and epic, and also they are very personal and very much also Shakespearean in the scope of emotion that is displayed not just by the main characters but by all the characters, such that every scene that is constructed seems to be filled with so much passion and so much almost a sense of the gritty, and that includes the scenes of violence and also the scenes of contemplation and quiet apprehension, and also the day-to-day scenes of the regular, ordinary life, whatever that means and that entails in the context of these films. And so with that, I'm just so much looking forward to this quote-unquote new version of The Godfather 3, which is again called Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone. And speaking of The Godfather 3, I've spoken a little bit about The Godfather 3, but I think The Godfather 3 is really quite excellent, and I acknowledge. I think one of the things that often comes up in discussions of The Godfather 3, it's almost like one has to acknowledge them from the outset, which is that it is critically considered to be a flawed film definitely when compared to The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2. And a lot of people, I think, point to specific aspects of The Godfather 3, for example, certain aspects of the casting, etc., that people point to as being the causes of the flaws of the film The Godfather 3. And I'm not here to debate those points, but what I can say, again, on a very maybe cursory level, is I always saw, for me personally, I saw there were two main areas of The Godfather Part 3 that I was always struggling with the most. So the first was, and again, I'm going to spoil The Godfather 3 here, but so if you haven't seen The Godfather 3, then please turn off this video. But if you have, then the two main points that I was very struggling with was the exclusion of the character of Tom Hagen due to certain reasons that we understand had to do with failure of negotiations with Robert Duvall and the inability to come to terms with that. So his character, I thought, was very crucial, and it was absolutely essential. And we got that sense during the entire arc of his character in The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2. I mean, in particular, his character arc in The Godfather Part 2 is, in my view, stunning. Absolutely stunning. He goes in so many directions, in so many places as a character, that by the end of the second film, when he's in that scene with Pentangeli, and where they're talking about the Corleone family was like the Roman Empire, and then Tom Hagen says it was once, and they're smoking cigars, and this is talking about when a plot against the emperor failed. Right, the plotters always had the chance to clean up, right? And Pentangeli counters as only the rich guys, Tom, right? And so that leads to one of the most poignant scenes in the entire cycle of films, in my opinion, which is the scene between Tom Hagen and Frank Pentangeli in part 2. So that is an example of how I felt that the Tom Hagen character was really essential in The Godfather 3. And if you think about it, the notion of the cyclical nature of Michael Corleone in this cycle of films, I think is played out really vividly and in stark, almost achingly beautiful literary terms in the way in which he interacts with his various brothers, right? And if you know that he has, of course, the brotherly relationship with Sonny that is carried out to its certain conclusion in the first film, The Godfather, because of what happens to Sonny's character. And then the second film, that one of the key relationships is, of course, the relationship between Michael and Fredo. And of course, by the end of The Godfather Part 2, we see how that relationship plays itself out. So that's another brotherly relationship. Then the other brother, adopted, yes, but still very much a brother and with strong fraternal ties, is Tom Hagen. And so the relationship between Michael Corleone and Tom Hagen, I felt, was, that needed to be in many ways front and center of the film The Godfather Part 3. It didn't happen, of course, but it would have been it would have been a really beautiful parallel to see that occur. And the fact that it didn't, for me, I always felt was what made the film somewhat lacking in my view, The Godfather Part 3. In that, because I really wanted to see a kind of conclusion, if you will, to that key relationship that we saw so wonderfully realized and portrayed in The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, especially The Godfather Part 2. The other thing that I always struggled with in The Godfather Part 3 was the character of Michael Corleone himself. And I always go back and forth with this, to be perfectly honest. And I wonder if Michael Corleone, as we see him in Godfather Part 3, is he really the same Michael Corleone that we saw in The Godfather and indeed in The Godfather Part 2? Or is this Godfather Part 3 version of Michael Corleone a completely different and thus inconsistent character with the depictions that we saw in the other two films? And I always went back and forth in this, because I always saw, not always, but I tended to see, more often than not perhaps, that there was too much of a distinction. There's too much of a difference. But at the same time, I always have to remember that, first of all, there is a number of years that pass between The Godfather 2 and The Godfather Part 3. And so if I think to myself, well, how much have I changed in whatever to say 10 years or so, 10, 15 years? And if I think about myself, where I was 15 years ago versus where I am now, I can say that perhaps there have been a lot of changes to my own character and outlook and makeup, such that I can, in that sense, I could definitely buy it if, say, a character who is depicted one time and then depicted 15 years later, if those two separate depictions might see differences in character, outlook, and viewpoints on life, etc., I can certainly buy that. And in fact, perhaps it will be less of a natural depiction if these two separate depictions, separated by the space of a number of years, it would probably be less natural if they were exactly the same. And so, because of the inherent nature of growth and development and aging, I think there is room for differences in character development or growth, or whatever the term we might want to apply here. And so I think that is one way we can look, or I can look at the Michael Corleone character in Part 3. Another thing, though, that I admit I go back and forth on, and I think it's actually a very exciting kind of inner dialogue, if you will, in terms of how to approach The Godfather Part 3 in respect of its relationship with Godfather and The Godfather Part 2. And that is is it really the case that Michael Corleone in Part 3 is so radically different from how he was in Part 1 and Part 2? Or perhaps it can be said that the Michael Corleone that we saw, say, in the first film, The Godfather, before his character, quote-unquote, entered the family business, maybe that younger Michael Corleone is indeed the spirit that we see embodied once again, this time in an older, but still very much the same kind of young, youthful Michael Corleone that we saw in the first film, now reprised in the third film. So maybe is Part 3's Michael the same as the younger Michael before he entered the family business? We do see, of course, in Part 3 elements quite strong and strikingly represented, showing Michael Corleone in Part 3 wanting, in essence, to get out, right? That's what he wants to do. He wants to get out. Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in, right? But the point is he wants to get out. And so if that's the case, then we can say, or it can be said maybe, that his depiction is very much more of the youthful kind of Michael that we saw smiling and enjoying life in the first film, before certain events in the first film took hold and changed the trajectory of his life forever. So maybe that's one way to look at it, at least from my perspective. Another way then to think about the whole saga is maybe, I mean, granted too, we see elements and instances where Michael in Part 2 also is trying to make maneuvers in order to, in essence, get out and turn legitimate. I think that's the whole point of the trajectory of the way in which Michael is trying to transform the family business from what it was, say, in Part 1, with its center in New York and all the criminal or quasi-criminal elements that were involved in some of the family business operations, outside of the olive oil business, of course. And then in Part 2, of course, we see him trying to maneuver his way into Las Vegas, gambling in Las Vegas. It is a legal venture, so it is quote-unquote legitimate. So there are efforts, arguably, for turning more into legitimate enterprises, although we realize that the criminal elements exist in many places, even in the upper echelons of political power, as well as the underlying criminal underworld, represented by elements like the old New York ties, represented by Pentangeli and what was left behind by Clemenza, etc., in that element, and the Rosado brothers and all that plot line there. And then also that's applied even further in terms of dynamism with the introduction and intervention of Hyman Roth and his influence, as we know. And then also we have the upper echelons of power, which are all connected, by the way, in terms of U.S. government and the way in which certain aspects of U.S. government are either trying to support or trying to thwart the efforts of Michael Corleone, maybe in line with the ultimate underlying plot of the Hyman Roth, etc. So in that sense, it could be seen, of course, to be a move towards legitimate enterprises that is thwarted by many different acts against the family. So perhaps that move is therefore consistent with the Michael Corleone character wanting to become legitimate. And thus the character that we see that is very much wanting to get out in Part 3 is thus consistent not just with the youthful Michael character from Part 1, but also the character in Part 2 that is still very much the head of the family, but also, in terms of his ambitions for the family operations, a businessman. And so I think that is very much, maybe, it could be said to be therefore consistent with the trajectory, although it goes in very different directions due to circumstances that arise, as we know. Okay, so why am I saying this? So I'm saying this because it seems to me, therefore, that it can be said that the Michael Corleone character in Part 3 is therefore very consistent with the character that we saw in the first two films. Another way to look at Part 2, of course, is perhaps Part 2 is making the opposite case, namely maybe Part 2 and all the events that happened in Part 2 are trying to make the argument that maybe Michael Corleone was always the intelligent and Machiavellian character all along. Maybe when he was the youthful Michael, before he joined the family business, there's a sense of the innocence. I think that's portrayed very much so in Part 1 and then Part 3. But maybe Part 2 might be suggesting that he was always this kind of Machiavellian character, and that this way of dealing with all of his enemies is innately part of his character, and thus that might point to some kind of sinister aspect of his character, perhaps. Thus, maybe making the opposite case, that Michael was all along this kind of Machiavellian figure. And I think that's also a very strong argument to make in terms of a viewing of Part 2, and a very effective one. If that's the case, though, then that means that the Michael in Part 3, I would argue, is not that Machiavellian at all. He seems to be very much affected by his hopes of getting out of illegitimate operations, maybe due to the onset of age and the passing of years, maybe feeling tired in terms of having to keep one step ahead of all the family operations, etc. And so maybe, therefore, there is that difference that is struck between the Michael of Part 2 and the Michael of Part 3. And it's that back and forth that I always struggled with in my own mind whenever I viewed Part 3. But ultimately, what always helped me in that viewing of Part 3 was the comparison to King Lear and to Shakespeare. And I'm not the biggest Shakespeare scholar or expert, but one of the ways that I try to understand the work of King Lear in particular is that King Lear, in terms of all of its intrigue, its political intrigue, and also human drama and betrayal and disappointment that is intertwined in that very interesting story, very powerful story. It also feels like it's a story that is, in many senses of the phrase, a story about identity crisis, and how characters under a great deal of stress presented by the narrative, how they deal with this sense of identity crisis. And if I think of it that way, and I think of Godfather 3 as being a kind of King Lear type of story, with Michael Corleone being the King Lear type of figure in this story of empire, then I think that notion of identity crisis finds room in the discussion of Michael Corleone and the perspective of his character, and whether or not his character is consistent with his character as we saw it in the other films or not, or maybe it's consistent with some parts but not others, etc., etc. So, but I think that kind of shifting dialogue, if you will, a viewpoint on the character, I think is very helpful. And so, and I find the connection with King Lear to be even more of a great support, if you will, for at least giving one room to breathe and make those sorts of push and pull dialogue and maybe somewhat contrasting viewpoints, but still being able to hold those at the same time. Because I think ultimately it also comes down to the fact that Michael Corleone is one of the most fascinating characters that has been established in American cinema in the latter half of the 20th century. And so I think this kind of fascination and involvement with the character and who he is, and wanting to know exactly who he is I think, at the heart of many people's admiration for these films, including Part 3. Because it is undeniably a story about Michael Corleone in a certain aspect in a given part of his life. So Uh, so those are the two general areas that I find I struggle with. But perhaps, especially with this latter component, with the discussion of the character of Michael Corleone, maybe I'm suggesting the sense that maybe struggle isn't the right word, but rather I tend to have varying points of view, oftentimes held simultaneously, with regard to this very complex figure in American cinema. And so, I mean, I think but ultimately, I think that can be said to be a positive thing. So that's probably something that I will be looking forward to. One of the things I'm going to be looking forward to very much when the Godfather Coda, the Death of Michael Corleone, arrives, and I'll be able to experience it and to see if at all this perspective or perspectives on the character of Corleone, Michael Corleone, change, or whether they stay pretty much rooted in the same kind of dynamic sense of varying interpretations that I find myself caught in at the moment when I think about his character. But again, I think that can be ultimately taken as a positive, even though I do admit to struggling very much so when it comes to trying to get a handle on his character, especially in part 3, which is, again, one of the things why I think it's fascinating. So.